I think you've got to give up some of that control in order to grow. But you still have to have the brand standards and the guidance, because if I just control everybody at 30 or 35 or 40 units, that's not going to work.
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. Hello and welcome back to the RevOps Champions podcast. Today, I'm joined by Doug Imholte, franchise programs practice leader at Marsh McLennan Agency and a longtime franchise executive and advisor who has spent his career helping franchise organizations build stronger, more resilient businesses. Doug's perspective is shaped by firsthand experience as a franchisee before becoming a trusted advisor to franchisors across North America. That journey gives him a practical understanding of the operational, financial, and leadership challenges franchise systems face as they grow, and how those challenges affect both franchisors and franchisees. Today, Doug helps franchise brands think beyond insurance, partnering with leadership teams to strengthen operational discipline, reduce enterprise risk, improve franchisee support, and create systems that enable sustainable growth. His work reflects a simple philosophy. Resilient organizations aren't built by reacting to problems. They're built by leading well before the problems arise. Doug, welcome to the RevOps Champions podcast.
Thanks, Brendan. I'm really looking forward to being here.
Yeah, it's good to have you.
Thank you.
Doug, let's dive in. So you began your career as a franchisee before becoming a trusted advisor to franchisors. Looking back, how did that experience shape the way you approach leadership and the guidance you provide to franchise brands today?
That's a great question. I had been working for some startup technology companies back in the mid to late 90s, and I wanted to own my own business, if you will. But I was smart enough to know that, doing this all by myself probably wasn't going to be the most successful. So I found a brand that I wanted to be with. It was a wireless cellular brand. Based out of Michigan. I bought the franchise rights for Minnesota and became a franchisee. And there were so many lessons I learned. And the first is, I'm a top line guy in general. I just, think grow. But one of the things I realized first is growth is not the answer to all problems, right? You have to have the systems in place, and you really have to make sure that people understand, where you're going, where the boat's headed, or what the mountain is that you're going up. And, building those systems to help you grow, because we got over our skis a little bit. And then ultimately, we got it to 7 locations and we sold in the spring of 2008. We were fortunate to sell when we did in the spring of 2008 because of what was happening after that. It wasn't a truly rewarding financial path, right? I mean, we were able to successfully exit, but, that experience really, number one, kind of provided me that guidance to say, okay, I really like the franchise industry. I'm really seeing, kind of what works, what doesn't from a franchisee to franchisee perspective, as well as franchisor to franchisee. And it led me to this path at Marsh McLennan, which I really love what I do. I'm really passionate about what I do in terms of working with brands.
That's awesome. So Doug, early in your career, as you sort of touched on there, you believed growth was the answer to most business challenges. So what changed your perspective, and what does sustainable growth look like for franchise organizations today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I came at it because I was a sales guy, Brendan, right? So I'm like growth, and then I let somebody else have to pick up the baton and make it happen. And so I think, from a standpoint of having retail stores and building these locations, hiring was so critical. If we were not losing people, we weren't, I'm trying to grow and give that message, but we had to make sure we had the right culture there, right? That was really important, that we had the system so people could effectively handle more transactions. We could handle more people. We could understand what KPIs were that we had to measure in order to focus on those things, right? And so that was really important. And when I look at this from a franchising standpoint is, a lot of times, often we'll see, hey, I've got a great model. I've got a great business model. I've got one or two locations and I've got a client base that really likes me. We're well known in this demographic, in this particular area, this demographic. And so we want to grow it. And it's that I'm going to grow too fast. I'm going to go outside this region. I'm going to add too many locations, too many franchisees without the strong focus on, who are we, selling licenses to, right? What is there? Are they bought into what our vision is, what our plan is? What are our brand standards? And are we, I think one of the mistakes I know the brand that I bought into, one of the mistakes they made is they had kind of a lot of side agreements. Well, these are the FTD and these are the standards, but you can do this. And it was everything from marketing to attire, and those things, just have an impact. And so it's great. You're like, hey, we've sold 50 or 100 or 200 or 400 licenses. And now how are you going to get everybody rowing in the same direction with the same plan and adhere to those brand standards without a lot of people coloring outside the lines? Yeah. And then what we see, just to kind of weave in a little bit of what we do, is the one area there's a coverage without getting too intrinsic called franchisors, errors, and omissions. So as a franchisor, your professional service is the services you provide to the franchisees, from what's listed in the FDD through the support that you provide, your franchise business coaches provide, that sort of thing. And if you try to get too many franchisees open too quickly, and they allegedly suffer financial harm, very likely that they're going to come back and start filing claims against you, the franchisor. And then all of a sudden, that brings your growth to a halt. And now you're kind of looking at, we're taking, we got to handle these claims and handle these things and kind of get things right. And so that's, again, long answer to my perspective is, hey, how do you properly scale to focus on, let's get those first X number right, 10, 25, 40 right, to create raving fans of the brand, the franchisees, and use that as the springboard.
Yeah. So Doug, I mean, you've already obviously started touching on some of this, but, so as these organizations grow from, 10 to 30 to 40 units, things obviously break down during those growth phases already. Even just getting from 10 to 30 is there's some fundamental shifts that happen. But one of the things I keep hearing from experts on this show and otherwise is there's so many brands, they get to 30 units and they think, okay, this is it. Now we're on our way to 100. And they actually never make it past 40 in many cases. And you're starting to sort of touch on why that might happen. What are the earliest signs from your perspective that leadership and operational alignment beginning to break down? Like, what have you found are the most effective ways to keep teams focused on those sort of goals and getting everyone rowing in the same direction?
Yeah. It's a great question. I have about a dozen things running through my mind, right? I mean, it's one of the things we all talk about. I know you and your firm talk about as well, is like those unit level economics is so important, right? So you want to say, okay, whether it's the first 10 or 25 or 30 or whatever, you say, okay, we got 30 open. Great. Let's go. Well, how are those 30 performing? Right. And, the other thing I would really look at, and I ask this to my clients all the time, especially emerging growth ones, I'd say, how are you supporting your franchisees? And I said, if we were to call the franchisees and just give them truth syrup and say, at this stage, you have 25 or 30 open, how is the franchisor supporting you? And what are 2 or 3 things they could be doing better that they're not doing, or that they're doing now that they shouldn't be doing? I think those are really effective questions early on. Because again, sometimes it's, hey, we got 30 open, they're making it for the most part, but there isn't that focus of how are we supporting them and how can we be doing that better? again, it's all about the guidance and support. So you're saying, hey, how do we get them? How do we get them to that next level in terms of unit level economics, whatever that number is?
Mm-hmm.
And then, by the way, they're going to be your most raving fans to bring in other franchisees.
Right. Yeah.
So those are things I really focus on.
Yeah. No, and that makes total sense because again, if they don't do that, eventually when let's just say they get to, 80 or 90 units and they've now hit, royalty, self-sufficiency and whatever. If they haven't done those things up until that point, it's going to start showing up in the FDD, and suddenly they're going to wonder why they aren't getting any new franchisees, because once, as part of the franchise sort of sales or dev process, there's somewhere in that process is, well, go and check out the FDD, whether you're working with a broker or just with ChatGPT. Eventually you're going to say, as a prospective franchisee, go and look at the FDD, and then suddenly everything goes quiet and they wonder why. That's because they haven't been proactive in supporting their franchisees until that point. Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah. And I guess, and which is interesting, I know, there are, some of the best franchise attorneys and you've already alluded to the fact that, what the work that you do is very closely either following or leading in the work with franchise attorneys. And in your case, and the franchise attorneys that I've spoken to, they're like, we don't really want to be doing like the reactive cleanup work. I mean, obviously that's what you get paid for, but you would prefer to do the proactive work to prevent those things from happening, because when it gets to that point, when they start bringing you and the attorneys in, that's typically not the greatest place for a franchise brand to be if they're looking to grow, correct?
Yeah, and I'll give you it's a great point. I'll give you a couple examples there. I mean, because of the joint employer pendulum has swung back and forth, right? And we've seen some brands that have pulled back on training that they've provided to the franchisees, specifically maybe safety training, things of that nature. Of course, they don't want to provide HR guidance, but they've kind of just then fully taken their hands off the wheel, right? And so, we are a full service risk management firm. So for some of the brands, we actually provide a lot of their outsourced training for them. So there's some brands that we work with that there's a lot of driving. They have trucks, they have vehicles on the road that are wrapped, and we help them proactively create their driver safety manual. We're doing quarterly safety webinars. We're sitting on their safety committee overall that they might have as part of their FAC. And we're saying that to say, okay, franchisor, you still have these responsibilities. It's about, in this case, moving forward, right? And the small part that we like to play in growth, if you will, and operations is saying, hey, we want to keep everybody moving forward effectively. And if we can take some of those things off your plate and provide those support to your franchise business coaches and support to the franchisees in the area of all these things that, we talked about, safety and HR, in addition to the insurance piece, because we're talking about risk, that keeps both the franchisees focused on growing their business and the franchisor focused on growing their brand. So absolutely, it's when we talk about brand standards, Brendan, like that is part of it, right? What are your brand standards that your franchisees are delivering, because they're delivering, or their employees are delivering on that brand promise. And so if they're coloring outside the line, that's going to come back and impact not only other franchisees, but it's going to impact you, the franchisor. And that's going to, again, have an impact on growth and profitability.
Yeah. And of course, and because that inconsistency, sort of coming back to a prospective new franchisee, whether they're looking, at one unit or multiple units, when they eventually start interviewing existing franchisees and they're hearing different stories from each one, that inconsistency, I'm guessing, probably doesn't give them a lot of faith that might be the right brand for them to, invest all their hard-earned cash into.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's many examples of that. Yeah.
Yes, I know. We seem to be hearing them way too often. Okay. So, Doug, let's switch gears here for a little bit. Your leadership philosophy has been described very similarly to us, which is ready, fire, aim. Right? So, building a solid foundation, taking action, continuously refining the process. How do you strike the right balance between operational consistency and giving teams the flexibility to adapt?
Yeah, great question. So sometimes, especially because of the industry that we're in, there can be sometimes a paralysis by analysis piece, right? And so I really try and tell my team, we've got to deliver on our promise and we're going to make mistakes and that's okay. We're going to be accountable for those mistakes. We're going to look at, are there things that led to that mistake? Because we all do it and they're led by somebody that, listen, I'm out there doing it constantly. So I want to lead by example in that regard, Brendan, and provide grace as long as, we're accountable. Let's work on fixing it. But I really want them to be empowered to, go out and deliver on it. The other piece that's really important, and it's something that as we've grown, I've had to really make sure that I've kind of had to double back on this, which is the communication and the vision piece. As we brought people on to the team that, they have a specific role and responsibility, but I want them to know what the bigger vision is and what our role is, what we're delivering to both franchisees and franchisors, and then continually communicate that. So we all know that, hey, if this is your role, right? You're doing certificate of insurance compliance and you're getting certs out and you're doing these sorts of things. You think, that's not really important, to let them know that they're really an important cog in this. And here's how it all fits together.
And why it's important. Yeah.
And absolutely why it's important. And then listen, if you stub your toe and if you make a mistake, just own up to it, right? Let's not be super defensive. Let's own up to it and then just understand and keep moving forward. And that's the recalibration piece.
Sure. Yeah. So you're touching on something else that I wanted to ask you about, which is one of the things that we see in our work, setting up the revenue systems for franchisors. So part of what we're doing in order for us to set up the revenue system, which is built around a central CRM and then integrates with their technology and whatever their data systems are. One of the things that we have to get clear is what are the processes at the corporate level and then at the franchisee level, and what is the data or the metrics or KPIs that they're tracking at each of those? Because that is the information we need to build into the CRM so that they have a revenue operations system that is actually maturing and enabling them to make better decisions over time. And one of the big disconnects that we see a lot is the metrics that drive the franchisees is almost the polar opposite of what drives the franchisors, right? So again, so this is really the whole data conversation. So, organize, whether you were in the franchise space or not, organizations have dashboards full of metrics, yet performance doesn't necessarily always improve. So from your perspective, because I know you're looking at numbers all the time, what separates companies that simply measure results from those that truly use the data to drive better decisions and stronger outcomes?
Yeah. Before we get to that, can I just ask you, what are you seeing at the franchisor level when they're saying, hey, these are the KPIs we're measuring? Are you seeing consistency in what they're trying to measure, that their key KPIs versus maybe what franchisees are? Or are you seeing swings in different, what they want to measure? What are you seeing?
Yeah. I think the glaring difference, and across the board really, except for the most sophisticated brands who've already figured it out, and we'll come maybe to the mindset piece later, which I believe separates the ones that do succeed and from those that don't. But this is, you don't have to be all that smart and have all that much experience in the franchise space to understand the difference between how, corporate fran dev teams are incentivized versus how franchisees are incentivized. And so that's really where it starts, is that the incentives are so different. Right. And because the incentives are different, the KPIs or metrics are going to be different. And over time, if it's not addressed, and that conversation you were talking about earlier, of explaining to each stakeholder why the role that they have and the metrics that they're measuring are so important to the bigger success. And that is so important. So it's not just a matter of having all this data that means that we can make better decisions if it's the wrong data, right?
Yeah.
So it's having that clarity at each step. And then the other thing that we keep hearing over and over again is how so many franchisees weren't set up for success from a financial metric perspective. obviously for them, profitability is a very key metric, but they don't understand all the things further up the P&L that actually impact their profitability and allow them to focus on those things to ensure that there's actually a bottom line at the end of the day, whereas franchisors are focused on the top line, right?
Yeah. I think data is, we could have a 2-hour conversation on data, right? I think data is great, but there's so much data now. Like, what's the key data? Trying to keep the main thing. And I understand sometimes, what a franchisor's measuring versus what a franchisee is measuring. I get it. Sometimes they're going to be certainly different, but I do think it comes back to unit level economics and how to help franchisees understand what are the key metrics there, right? Without being, franchisees can get so bogged down in the bottom line that they forget about growing the top line, right? And I just think it's that there's a balance there that, trying to maintain that is really key. I know there's going to be some conflict, and I'm okay with conflict as long as there is the culture that conflict is okay.
Yeah, and there's clear lines of communication when there is conflict. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Because then it's like, hey, we've got these lines. We know where we're all going, and there's going to be some tension, but we're going to work through that because of the culture that we have, because of the operation support that we have, et cetera.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things, like specific to data that we're seeing, because typically when we're being brought in is because the franchisor, the brand, the network, they've outgrown whatever systems they had. And in most cases, they have siloed systems. So they have, one system for FranDeb and one system for this and one system for that. Instead of having, one system where the data can flow from no matter how, we have some franchisors that have 1,000 units. That's where every unit's numbers are visible to make decisions at the corporate level. And then, of course, you have permissioning for each franchise unit, or if you have multi-unit owners, they can obviously have all the data that they need to make decisions and help and support their franchisees. So I guess that's kind of where we see it the most, is why did it take them so long to...
It has to be so helpful for the benchmarking piece, Brendan, right?
Right.
Because I harken back, this was the early 2000s, right? Where we would see what our revenue numbers were, right? Be able to benchmark what my inventory, how much inventory I have, my labor costs, marketing costs, to be able to see that in relation to my other franchisees. I think that's really important to have, to say, okay, I'm spending more labor during these times than my colleagues. What am I doing? Is it a choice I'm making because I want to have more people on? Why am I carrying more inventory than other franchisees? And that's what we talked about. What is the key data? Keeping those key KPIs, I think, are really important.
Yeah. And it kind of comes back to what you were saying earlier about the unit level economics and the information that ultimately needs to show up consistently in an FDD if the brand is still planning on scaling, and in which case all new franchise or prospective franchisees are going to be looking at the FDD. So how do you structure the FDD to make sure that it can evolve as the brand, scales and grows? Anyway, it's an interesting challenge, and which comes back to what I was saying earlier about what we see the difference between the brands that scale more effectively and those that get stuck is this mindset of knowing that going from 1 to 10 to 30 units, things are going to change, right? Even at that level. But then going from 30 units to 75 or 100, things are going to change again. And once you get to 100 or 120 or 150, you're going to have to change again. And the things that change are, which is quite interesting, but not ironic at all, is so we talk about, so the revenue operations systems that we build are based on 4 pillars, which is people, process, data, and technology. And the technology comes last. So it starts with leadership, right? That's the people component. It's leadership. It's, again, showing everybody where we're going. It's the communication piece that we've already touched on multiple times. But if you don't have that, and if those leaders don't realize when they need to bring in additional leaders or when they potentially need to move aside themselves because they might have been, and we see this, a lot in the franchise system, there are incredible leaders who know that their thing is getting brands from 10 to 100 or whatever that is. And then when they get to 100, they move to another brand because there are other people who can take brands from 100 to 300 and beyond. But again, it's just having that mindset that what got us here isn't going to get us to where we're going.
Yeah. There's a few kind of founders that come to mind when I think about this. Joe Keeley, who started College Nannies and Tutors back here in the Twin Cities a number of years ago. I'm just using him as an example. I think when you start any concept, right, you've got control. You know what you're doing. I want to do this. I want my team to do this. And I think a lot of times when you bring on those initial franchisees, they kind of want to either maybe friends or family or people in that orbit. And they're like, yeah, tell us what to do. Right? You still have your hands on the wheel and we're going to control it as much as I can. And I think to be able to say how we get to find that next level, right? Where we're going to get people outside that orbit where it's now people that our friend dev team are bringing in or brokers are bringing in or whatever, where I'm guiding, but I'm giving up. I'm not controlling, right? Because I think you've got to give up some of that control in order to grow, but yet you still have to have the brand standards and the guidance in order that the franchisees are singing out of that same hymnal. And I'm not sure I'm giving any great guidance there, but I think that's the thread, the needle that they have to thread to go through to say, because if I just try and control everybody at 30 or 35 or 40 units, that's not going to work. But if I can just completely, you're on your own, that's not going to work either. And I think identifying those four things that you talked about and putting the process around each of those. I mean, I kind of think you should also have a process around your culture, right? Because that's going to define everything. I think those are some of the elements of brands that really then get to that next level.
Yeah, it does really seem to come down to, because I know it's interesting because in the work that you do and the work that we do, we were brought in as trusted advisors, but we were often put in a box that, it sits somewhere on the P&L, but we obviously we're seeing things beyond what we're essentially what our box says that we do, which is why I think these conversations we hope are really helpful, for the folks that are listening. Just if they can just learn, like if there's just one thing that you and I might remind them about that they've forgotten about or whatever, as they've gone from 30 units to 60 units or whatever, and they go, oh, actually this is probably the time that we need to make some changes here or whatever, then that's great.
Well, and the thing I would ask real quick is that I would just remind franchisors that if you're working with trusted franchise suppliers, right, that, treat us as a partner because we're going to act like a partner. So if you're like, hey, can I run something by you? Doesn't mean that we're involved in every strategic decision, but, treat your suppliers, especially those that have a lot of experience in the franchise space, bring them into the table and say, hey, have you seen this? What have you seen here? How can you help us? Do you have somebody else that we might be able to work with, from a CRM standpoint, et cetera? I think that's really important.
Yeah. And of course, and this is one of the greatest things about the franchise space, right? Is that the openness of people to want to help others, whether it's a multi-unit franchisee wanting to help other franchisees or franchisors or experienced people in all realms of the franchise space. It's incredible to see how open people are in wanting to help others, and they don't expect anything in return.
True.
Because they know that if the franchise industry continues to elevate and succeed, it brings everybody along, right?
Yeah.
So Doug, maybe many people think of risk management primarily as insurance, but your work goes far beyond that. How can franchisors use strategic risk management to strengthen operations, support franchisees, and create a more resilient organization?
Thanks for asking. So a lot of times people think of insurance as a commodity, and it's not a commodity. They think of just insurance as a pure bottom line thing, and that's not the case. What we do is come along and be a full service risk management provider so that we help brands. We want to protect the brand. We help them impact those things that go into insurance pricing. So if you have high turnover, that's going to lead to a number of issues. It's going to lead to higher work comp losses. It's going to lead to franchisee employees not knowing proper standards, and you're going to have customer issues. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. Also from a safety standpoint, I talked about providing safety resources. We have safety specialists here that help from anything from your OSHA compliance, your safety data sheets, your DOT. So if you're driving trucks or have trucks wrapped or that sort of thing. And that's where franchisors, I think, need to continue to provide that guidance to say this stuff is important, because if you don't do this, it's going to lead to losses, which number one is going to come back and pull the franchisor is going to be pulled into that from a vicarious liability standpoint, meaning they're going to be pulled into that claim. They're going to be named in that suit.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to affect franchisee to franchisee, and then it's going to affect overall insurability, right? So we face it if you're a brand, you're dealing with children, right? You're doing spa services, you're delivering, foodborne illness. If you're dealing with driving, any of those sorts of things that has risk, we want to come along and we've got the resources and the services to help franchise business coaches provide content to the franchisees or provide that training directly to the franchisees and their employees. By doing so, reduces risk, prevents things from occurring, and helps the franchisees stay focused on the main thing, which is growing their business.
Yeah. Again, there are a lot of parallels between what you do and what we do. It's like, because ultimately, so for example, the CRM that we're typically implementing as part of our revenue operations systems that we're doing for franchisors, HubSpot, but they think of it as software. And it's a line item of software, but what they're not understanding is how that software needs to be implemented and integrated into their operational systems and what value that brings. Anyway, but I'm not going to go there now. What I really wanted to ask you was coming back to, you work with brands that are very, very much in the emerging stages to incredibly successful, large, multi, 1,000 unit brands. One of the things we hear about all the time is so brands, they reach, depending on the industry and the specific brand, they reach royalty self-sufficiency between 50 and 75 units typically, right? Now you're dealing with brands that are lower than, they're maybe at 30 units. Who are the brands that are making that investment in what it is that you're doing and in sort of their risk management at that level? And how are those leaders of those brands different to the ones who aren't making that investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's an understanding of all those things that we talked about in terms of culture, in terms of unit level economics, in terms of the looking ahead 3 years. I think that's really key.
That's strategic leadership. Yeah,
absolutely. To say, okay, what kind of brand are we going to be in 3 years from now? And I know sometimes for an emerging growth brand, you're trying to get through the next 3 months. I get that. But keeping that, knowing where they're going, right? And so for us, I'll say, is it strategically important? Okay. I'll talk to some, CEOs or COOs or founders of, smaller units, and they're saying, hey, I want you guys to handle the insurance for the franchisees. We just want the least expensive option. Now, cost is just the same as your world. Cost or price is always important. We can get there, but if you're just worried about the cost in our world, what happens constantly are franchisees don't get the right coverage. They don't have the coverage for the main thing that they need. And I'll give you a couple of examples, right? We worked with a paint and sip brand where they looked at their first 35 franchisees, and roughly half of them didn't have something called host liquor liability coverage, which means if I went in and I started drinking and I overserved myself, I went out and got in an accident, they don't have coverage for that. They're going to I'm going to shut my doors. That's going to go back to the franchisor, right? There's a lot of examples like that. So we're saying, hey, you can do both. You can be cost competitive and do this the right way, because if not, it's going to come back and bite you, certainly down the road. I think sometimes it's maybe not a tangible discussion, like you got to do this, this, and this, but it has got to be strategically important. And we have some brands that we're working with now that are in unique industries where, insurance coverage, there's not a lot of carriers that will write it or write coverage to what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying, hey, new franchisees, you need to use these because we have the insurance requirements written out and we need to do that or we're going to, it's going to affect our growth down the road here.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting because we're seeing the same things. Like, by the time we get to speak to somebody who leveling up their systems when they're speaking to us, and we'll hear very similar stories. Well, it's like, oh, well, we went with a different software that was saving us, $700 a month, but they're not thinking of if they had, it's kind of the Toyota Corolla versus the Cadillac or whatever it is. Again, they both do what they need to do, but if so in our situation, like what happens is they've spent a lot of money outside of the software cost to try and make that cheaper software work, which has actually cost them thousands of dollars more per month because they've had more human intervention having to make that system work. And what is the cost of that? But not only that, but then, so let's say they did that at, 30 units, and then at 100 units, they've got to replace that anyhow because that software isn't going to scale from 100 to 300 units. So then have to go through the whole process again. To your point, we get the fact at that point, they're just thinking 3 months ahead. And to think 3 years ahead is really, really hard, especially when you don't have royalty self-sufficiency, which is why we typically we don't work with brands typically until they get to royalty self-sufficiency, because that's when they realize where they need to invest to get from 75 units to 300 units and beyond. But interesting to see the parallels though.
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg.
Yeah. And again, it's that sort of mindset. So we talk about it as total opportunity cost. It's not so it's not just the cost of in your case the insurance, in our case the technology that we're implementing for you. It's what do you have to do in other hard and soft costs if you don't have a system that allows for the automation that you need to successfully grow the business, right?
Yeah, we use a similar term. We have total cost of risk. What is your total cost of risk? There's a lot of things that go into total cost of risk.
Yeah, and you've already touched on a couple. I mean, like, for example, if you, like the drinking example or whatever, and, that's that business is over. What does that cost you?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so Doug, to wrap up, looking ahead, what do you believe will separate the strongest franchise organizations over the next few years? And what should leaders start doing today to prepare for that future?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We hear the term responsible franchising, and what does that mean? Still think it comes down to, I think knowing as a brand who you are, what you deliver or sell, right? Being clear on that. I think there's sometimes brands are like, oh, we do this and then we're going to do this and we're going to do this and we're going to do this. I think being really clear on who you are and what you do and then what your plan is, because that gets everybody engaged. That to me is, I just think, the real key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think is really good advice because, I mean, that's what also creates that consistency that you've touched on multiple times, where, again, the consistency for franchisees to be successful. And if franchisees are successful, then you'll be successful as a brand, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, really good advice. Doug, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a great conversation. I look forward to more of these.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And we'll see you at the Fager Franchise Summit this summer.
Yes, looking forward to that. That's only a few weeks away. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, early August. Thanks, Brandon, very much.
Thanks, Doug.
Bye-bye.